Jake Miller, a solitary construction worker, shares half his sandwich with Meera, a hungry, traumatized girl, defying his manager's scorn. That night, a mysterious red Mustang blocks the site's entrance, driven by retired Colonel Sandra Lee, Meera's grandmother. She reveals Meera's emotional breakthrough after Jake's kindness, offering him a role in a veteran rehabilitation program. As Jake navigates this unexpected path, his simple act ripples, challenging the site's dismissive culture and hinting at deeper connections. What will Jake discover at the Veteran Center, and how will his quiet compassion reshape lives? The story unfolds with heart and mystery. The sun beat down on the construction site, a relentless glare that turned sweat into rivers and dust into a second skin. Jake Miller sat alone, as he always did, his back pressed against a stack of concrete blocks. His lunch, a plain sandwich wrapped in crinkled plastic, rested in his calloused hands. For years, he'd eaten in solitude, the hum of machinery and the chatter of coworkers fading into a dull roar he barely noticed. But today, something shifted. His eyes drifted to the chain-link fence separating the site from the street beyond, where a frail girl stood, her small frame swaying slightly. Her hands clutched her stomach, and her face, smudged with dirt, bore a quiet desperation. Her gaze locked onto the sandwich, not with greed but with a raw, aching hunger that pierced Jake's chest. He hesitated, his fingers tightening around the bread. A flicker of doubt crossed his mind. What if someone saw? What if it caused trouble? But the girl's eyes, wide and unblinking, held him captive. Without a word, he tore the sandwich in two, the larger half revealing soft, uneven layers of turkey and cheese. He rose, crossed the dusty ground, and extended the bigger piece through the fence. The girl's trembling hands reached out, accepting it with a reverence that made Jake's throat tighten. "I thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible, before she turned and fled, clutching the food as if it might vanish. Jake watched her disappear, the smaller half of the sandwich heavy in his hand. For a moment he felt lighter, as if he'd shed a weight he hadn't known he carried. "Jake, what the hell are you doing?" The manager's voice shattered the quiet, sharp and accusing. Jake spun around to find the man looming, his face flushed with irritation. "Don't encourage those beggars. You'll have the whole damn pack swarming us." A few workers nearby snickered, their laughter cutting like shards of glass. Others glanced over, their expressions blank, unwilling to take a side. Jake's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. He'd learned long ago that words rarely softened blows. His father's fists had taught him that. Instead, he bowed his head, the sandwich now tasteless in his mouth, and shuffled back to his spot. The lunch break dragged on, the air thick with unspoken judgment. No one joined him. No one ever did. As he chewed the dry, crumbling bread, Jake's mind lingered on the girl. Her eyes had stirred something deep within him, a flicker of warmth he couldn't name. It wasn't pity, nor was it guilt. It was something older, something he'd buried under years of silence and solitude. Growing up, he'd been invisible, a boy who ducked his head and braced for the next hit. Here, at the construction site, he was no different. Just another pair of hands, hauling steel and concrete, his existence barely registered by the men around him. But today, for the first time in years, someone had seen him. Not the worker, not the quiet man with rough hands, but him. And it left him unsteady, like a crack forming in a foundation he'd thought was solid. "Miller!" The foreman's bark jolted him from his thoughts later that afternoon. "You're behind on Section B. What's the holdup?" Jake wiped the sweat from his brow, his sleeves streaked with grime, and pointed to a structural flaw in the framework, a miscalculation the engineers had overlooked. It was a small thing, but it could have caused problems down the line. The foreman scoffed, his lip curling. "That's why we have inspectors. Just do your damn job." Jake nodded, swallowing the urge to argue. He turned back to his work, the weight of the day settling deeper into his bones. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and gray, the other workers filed out, their voices loud with plans for the weekend. Bars, barbecues, ball games. No one spared Jake a glance, let alone an invitation. He lingered, his eyes scanning the fence one last time, hoping the girl might reappear. She didn't. With a sigh, he slung his worn jacket over his shoulder and began the walk to his rented room, a cramped space that smelled of mildew and solitude. On the way, he passed a corner store, its neon sign buzzing faintly. He paused, fishing through his pocket for loose change. The coins clinked softly, a meager sum, but enough. Inside, he bought 2 sandwiches, one for tonight, one for tomorrow, just in case. That evening, as Jake sat on the edge of his sagging mattress, peeling back the wrapper of his dinner, his phone buzzed. An unknown number flashed on the screen, the message brief but startling. "Thank you for today. Someone wants to meet you." No name, no address. Jake frowned, his first thought that it was a prank. He set the phone down, dismissing it, but unease gnawed at him. 20 minutes later, the front desk phone rang, insistent and shrill. The clerk's voice crackled through the line. "There's a red car blocking the construction site entrance. Can you come check?" Jake stepped outside, the cool night air brushing against his skin, and froze. A sleek red Mustang GT gleamed under the streetlights, its bold presence jarring against the gritty backdrop of the site. A woman, perhaps in her early 50s, stepped out of the driver's seat. Her posture was rigid, her hair pulled back tightly, and she wore an old military shirt that spoke of discipline and history. Her eyes, sharp and assessing, locked onto Jake, sizing him up in a single glance. Beside her stood the girl from earlier, now dressed in clean clothes, her expression unchanged, cautious, yet curious. The woman extended a hand, her grip firm. "I'm retired Colonel Sandra Lee." "Chantilly," she said, her voice steady but warm. "This is my granddaughter. She's been in psychological treatment since losing her mother. She doesn't eat food from strangers, but today she ate your sandwich." Jake shifted, his boots scuffing the gravel, unsure how to respond. "I just didn't want her to go hungry," he mumbled, his voice rough from disuse. Sandra nodded, her gaze softening slightly. She reached into her jacket and pulled out an envelope, holding it out to him. "We don't repay kindness with money," she said, "but tomorrow I'll come back. I'd like to take you somewhere your compassion would be appreciated." Jake hesitated, his fingers brushing the envelope's edge before he took it. As he looked from Sandra to the girl, whose small hand clung to her grandmother's, he felt that flicker again. Something stirring, something alive. If Jake's kindness touched you, join us to uncover more unsung heroes. Your support amplifies these stories, giving meaning to small acts of compassion. Click subscribe, share, and be part of our mission to celebrate humanity. Inside the worn leather wallet wasn't a stack of bills, but a single photograph, its edges softened by time. It showed a young girl, her smile bright and unburdened, standing next to a woman in a crisp military uniform, her posture proud but her eyes warm. Jake's brow furrowed as he studied the image, the weight of its significance settling over him like dust. Sandra, the grandmother standing before him, caught his confusion and spoke, her voice steady but laced with a quiet ache. "That's my daughter," she said, her gaze flickering to the little girl now half hidden behind her. "Meera's mother. Meera hasn't said much since we lost her 3 months ago. Barely a handful of words, but today, she came home and told me about the man who shared his lunch with her." Jake's eyes drifted to Meera, who clutched the hem of her grandmother's coat, her small frame almost swallowed by the shadow of the older woman. Her dark eyes, wide and wary, held a depth that made Jake's chest tighten. He'd seen those eyes earlier that day, when he'd handed her half his sandwich without a second thought, her hunger more pressing than his own. Now standing in the fading light of the construction site, he felt the weight of her gaze, like she was searching for something in him he wasn't sure he possessed. "I'm sorry for your loss," he murmured, the words feeling inadequate as they left his lips. Sandra's face remained unyielding, her jaw set like someone who'd faced too many losses to let them break her. But her voice softened, just enough to betray the pain she carried. "Loss comes with the territory of service," she said. "What's harder is seeing what it does to the ones left behind." Her eyes lingered on Meera, and Jake saw a flicker of something raw, grief maybe, or the fierce protectiveness of someone determined to shield what little family remained. Around them, the hum of the construction site grew louder as workers began to gather, their curiosity drawn by the sleek black Mustang parked incongruously among the dust and gravel. Heads turned, murmurs rippling through the crowd as they speculated about the woman in the expensive car and the quiet girl at her side. The manager, a squat man with a perpetual scowl, pushed through the throng, his face reddening when he spotted Jake at the center of the commotion. "Miller, what the hell's going on here?" he barked, his voice sharp with irritation. Sandra turned slowly, her eyes narrowing as she sized him up with a cold precision that made the air feel heavier. "You must be the one who yelled at my granddaughter today," she said, her tone calm but cutting, like a blade wrapped in silk. The manager opened his mouth to protest, his hands gesturing wildly. I didn't yell at her directly," he stammered, but Sandra cut him off, her voice unyielding. "You didn't have to. You were loud enough for a grieving child to hear that her hunger was an inconvenience to you." The manager's bluster faltered, his shoulders sagging under the weight of her words. He tried to recover, his voice taking on a defensive edge. "We can't have people loitering around the site. It's a liability issue, plain and simple." Sandra's lips curved into a faint, humorless smile. "Interesting," she said, her tone laced with a quiet menace. "I'll be sure to remember that tomorrow when I return with representatives from the Veteran Outreach Program." She turned back to Jake, dismissing the manager as if he were no more significant than the dust under her boots. "7 a.m., she said, her voice firm but not unkind. "Be ready." With that, she guided Meera back to the Mustang, its engine roaring to life with a deliberate growl that seemed to echo her resolve. As the car pulled away, the manager rounded on Jake, his face a mix of fury and confusion. "What did you do, Miller? Who are these people?" Jake shrugged, his expression unreadable. "Just someone who noticed something you didn't," he said, his voice quiet but steady. That night, Jake lay awake, the dim glow of his bedside lamp casting shadows across the ceiling. Sleep eluded him, his mind tangled in thoughts of Meera's haunted eyes, the photograph of her mother in her proud uniform, and Sandra's words about the Veteran Outreach Program, delivered with the weight of both a promise and a warning. He couldn't shake the image of Meera's small hand reaching for the sandwich he'd offered, or the way her gaze had softened, just for a moment, when he'd smiled at her. For years, Jake had lived in the background, a man who moved through life unnoticed, his days blurring into a monotony of labor and solitude. But tonight, something stirred within him. A faint spark, not quite hope, but its quieter cousin, curiosity. He wondered what tomorrow would bring, what Sandra's cryptic invitation meant, and why, of all people, she'd sought him out. The uncertainty was unsettling, but it was also alive, a pulse he hadn't felt in years. The next morning, the construction site buzzed with its usual rhythm, hammers pounding, machinery groaning, until the Mustang reappeared, its sleek frame flanked by 2 military jeeps. The site stopped the worksite cold, workers pausing mid-task, their tools hanging limp as they stared in confusion. The manager burst from his trailer, his face a mask of indignation. "We don't have any business with the military," he shouted, waving his arms as if he could shoo the vehicles away. "You people need to go somewhere else." Sandra didn't acknowledge him. She stepped out of the Mustang, her presence commanding despite her unassuming stature, and walked straight to Jake. "Come with me," she said, her tone leaving no room for hesitation. Jake followed, climbing into the Mustang's passenger seat, his heart pounding with a mix of apprehension and intrigue as they drove away, the jeeps trailing behind. Their destination was a veteran reintegration center, a sprawling facility with clean lines and a quiet dignity. Inside, the air was filled with the soft hum of purpose. Veterans in recovery, working on projects, counselors speaking in low tones, and children, some as young as Meera, playing in a corner designed to feel like a sanctuary. Sandra led Jake to a small office, where she explained the center's mission, supporting wounded warriors and children who had lost parents in service. "We need someone to supervise our labor rehabilitation model," she said, her eyes steady on his. "Someone to teach soft skills to veterans in recovery. Would you like to try?" Jake blinked, caught off guard. His life had been one of manual labor, of keeping his head down and his hands busy. "I'm not educated," he said, his voice rough with self-doubt. "I don't know how to teach or talk to people." Before Sandra could respond, Meera stepped forward, her small hand slipping into his. Her voice, soft but clear, cut through the room's tension. But you know how to share half your sandwich without being afraid of losing your part. The words landed like a stone in still water, rippling through the room and silencing everyone within earshot. Jake's throat tightened, his eyes meeting Meera's, and for a moment he saw not just a grieving child, but a spark of trust, fragile but fierce. Sandra nodded, a faint smile touching her lips. The Department of Defense has approved funding for you to receive 3 months of basic training, she said. You start next week. Jake learned later that a security camera had captured his small act of kindness, the footage shared within the military community, sparking comments that warmed his heart and unsettled him in equal measure. We need more people like him, not just those putting on a show. He's not military, but his actions show the same decency as those who served. The construction site, meanwhile, faced a backlash for its treatment of Meera. The manager forced to call Jake back in a feeble attempt to save face. Jake didn't answer. What he didn't know was that Sandra's interest in him wasn't random. After Meera had spoken of the kind construction worker, Sandra had dug deeper, pulling security footage from nearby buildings. She'd watched Jake not only share his sandwich, but give Meera the larger portion, keeping the smaller half for himself. Then she'd run a background check, uncovering a man who'd lived quietly but carried a heavy past. Jake Miller, 34, son of a Vietnam veteran. Imagine who'd taken his own life when Jake was 15. No criminal record, no social media presence, just a man who'd been invisible his whole life, yet chose kindness when no one was watching. That choice, Sandra knew, was rarer than gold. Jake stood in the dim light of the Veteran Center's workshop, his calloused hands brushing against the rough grain of a wooden plank, convinced no one was watching. He wasn't one for the spotlight, never had been. Yet here he was, stepping into a world he hadn't earned. At least, that's what the whispers in his mind told him. The Veteran Center director, a grizzled man with decades of service etched into his weary eyes, had fought tooth and nail against hiring him. These men and women carry wounds deeper than you can imagine, the director had said, his voice heavy with conviction. Their trauma is complex, layered with sacrifice and loss. They need someone trained, someone who knows how to navigate the chaos of their minds. Jake, a civilian with no military background or clinical degree, was the furthest thing from that. Sandra, however, had seen something in Jake that the director couldn't. She didn't argue with words or credentials. Instead, she replayed the video, grainy footage from a construction site where Jake had worked until recently. In it, he was kneeling beside a young girl, Meera, who'd been scavenging for scraps near the site. He'd shared his lunch with her, not out of pity, but with the quiet understanding of someone who knew what it was to go without. Show me someone more qualified, Sandra had challenged the director, her voice steady but fierce. Find me someone who gets what it means to give without expecting a thank you, who understands sacrifice in their bones. And the director's jaw tightened, but he couldn't argue with the truth in her words. Reluctantly, he agreed to a trial period, though his skepticism hung in the air like dust. Jake's first day at the center was a minefield of doubt, his own and everyone else's. The veterans, men and women marked by war in ways both visible and hidden, watched him with guarded eyes. Missing limbs, burned scars, and stares that seemed to pierce through time itself followed him as he walked into the room. Sandra introduced him with a warmth that felt out of place in the tense silence. "This is Jake," she said, her voice cutting through the murmurs. "He's here to help with the woodworking program." A voice from the back, sharp and skeptical, called out, "What unit?" Sandra didn't flinch. "He's not military," she replied, her tone unwavering, "but he speaks your language." A tall man with a prosthetic leg let out a scoff, his bitterness palpable. "What language is that?" Sandra's eyes flicked to Jake, a silent nudge to step up. He hated the attention, the weight of their stares pressing against his chest, but he cleared his throat and spoke, his voice low but steady. The language of having just enough to share. The words hung there, simple yet heavy, and for a moment the room stilled. Some rolled their eyes, others looked away, but a few leaned in, intrigued by this outsider who dared to claim kinship. That afternoon, Jake set up the workshop, his movements deliberate, almost meditative. He didn't lecture or give instructions. Instead, he picked up a piece of wood and started shaping it into a simple bench, letting the rhythmic scrape of his tools fill the silence. A young veteran, his hands trembling from nerves or memory, approached hesitantly. Jake didn't make a fuss. He just handed him a sanding block, offering no questions, no pressure, just a quiet invitation to be useful again. The veteran took it, and for the first time in months, his hands found purpose. By the end of the week, 6 veterans were showing up regularly, their guarded postures softening as they worked side by side. By the end of the month, there was a waiting list, the workshop buzzing with the sound of saws and the faint stirrings of hope. The construction company Jake had left behind called 3 times, each offer sweeter than the last. Higher pay, better hours, a chance to return to the life he knew. The 3rd time, Sandra snatched the phone from his hand before he could answer. "He's busy," she told them, her voice firm but laced with pride. "He's building something more important now. He's helping people rebuild themselves." She hung up, and Jake just nodded, a flicker of gratitude in his eyes. He wasn't one for grand gestures, but he felt the weight of her belief in him, and it anchored him to this new path. A month later, Jake was named supervisor of the labor rehabilitation group. He didn't lead with words, never had, but his actions spoke louder. Each day, he split his lunch into 2 portions, setting one aside in case someone new showed up, hungry for more than just food. Meera, the little girl from the construction site, was a regular visitor now. She was growing stronger, her cheeks less hollow, her eyes brighter. She'd learned to draw, her small hands clutching crayons as she sketched her world. One day she handed Jake a picture, a sandwich and a Mustang, rendered in bold, uneven lines. Below it, in wobbly handwriting, she'd written, "Thank you for being kind when no one looked." Jake's breath caught in his throat. He couldn't find words, so he folded the drawing with care and tucked it into his breast pocket, where he'd once kept his mother's birth certificate, a relic of a life that had shaped his quiet compassion. No awards or applause could match the warmth of knowing he hadn't turned away when someone needed him. Under Jake's steady influence, the Veteran Center began to transform. The psychologists and counselors and therapists were still there, offering critical clinical care, but Jake brought something else, a space where worth wasn't measured by titles or talk, but by the work of one's hands. The veterans found solace in creating, their calluses a reminder that they could still capable of building something lasting. One morning, a former Marine who hadn't spoken in years approached Jake with a coffee in hand. No words passed between them, just a nod, a silent understanding that sometimes showing up was enough. Jake accepted the coffee, his heart swelling with a quiet pride he'd never learned to name. Sandra watched it all unfold from her office, her chest tight with emotion. The woodworking program grew, spilling over into metalwork and auto repair. The waiting list stretched longer, and success stories began to spread. Veterans finding jobs, reconnecting with families, or simply smiling for the first time in years. During a government inspection, an official peppered Jake with questions, scribbling notes about innovative therapeutic approaches and nonverbal communication frameworks. "What's your secret?" he asked, expecting a formula. Jake shifted uncomfortably, his hands stuffed in his pockets. "No secret," he said at last. "They just need to know they still have something worth giving." The official nodded, but his notes missed the heart of it. Jake had built a haven where broken people could mend broken things, and in the process, mend themselves. 6 months after Jake started, a letter arrived from the Department of Veterans Affairs arrived. They wanted to take his program national, complete with training modules, certifications, and protocols. Sandra found him in the workshop, staring at the letter as if it held a weight he couldn't yet carry. "You don't have to decide today," she said gently, her voice a steady anchor. Jake nodded, his gaze distant. Then, as he'd done so many times before, he tore off his sandwich in half and offered her the bigger piece. Sandra took it, her smile that held pride, hope, and a quiet certainty that Jake's work was far from done. Jake sat on the edge of the worn wooden bench, his calloused hands clasped tightly together, his gaze drifting toward the workshop across the dusty yard. The hum of activity filled the air. Veterans, their faces etched with stories of sacrifice and survival, worked together, their hands steady as they sanded and shaped a sturdy oak table. Each movement was deliberate, a quiet testament to resilience, to lives pieced back together after being torn apart. Jake's eyes softened as he watched them, his heart stirring with a mix of pride and something heavier, something unspoken. "They want to turn this into something complicated," he said at last, his voice low, almost swallowed by the rhythmic scrape of sandpaper and the distant hum of a radio. His friend, leaning against the wall with a skeptical tilt of his head, raised an eyebrow. "And you think it's simple?" The question hung in the air, sharp and probing, like a challenge Jake wasn't sure he could meet with words. He wasn't one for grand speeches or clever retorts. Words had always felt slippery to him, like trying to hold water in his hands. But as he turned his gaze back to the workshop, where a cracked mirror leaned against a nearby wall, reflecting the veterans' focused faces, and a young girl sat quietly sketching in a corner, her pencil scratching softly against the paper, Jake felt the weight of something deeper. "Not simple," he corrected, his voice steady now, carrying the conviction of someone who'd seen too much to believe in easy answers. "Just human." In that moment, Jake's mind drifted to the truth he'd come to understand, a truth carved into his bones through years of quiet observation. Not everyone had much to give. Some had barely enough to keep themselves afloat. But even those with the least, those who carried their own burdens in silence, could still offer half of what they had. A gesture, a moment of connection, a small act of kindness. It didn't take much to change everything. Jake wasn't the kind of man who could weave poetry from his thoughts or command a room with his voice. His words were rough, unpolished, like the raw lumber stacked in the workshop. But he believed in action, in the power of doing what was right when no one was watching, when the world wasn't waiting to applaud. He thought of the little girl, her name still a soft whisper in his memory. She'd come to the workshop weeks ago, her eyes wide but guarded, her small frame curled inward, as if she could make herself invisible. Trust had been stolen from her, chipped away by a world that hadn't been kind. Jake hadn't known her story, not fully, but he'd seen the way she flinched at loud voices, the way her fingers clutched her sketchbook like a lifeline. One afternoon, when the others were distracted, he'd knelt beside her, his voice gentle but firm, and offered her half of his sandwich. It wasn't much, just a simple thing, bread and turkey, something he'd thrown together that morning. But when she took it, her small hands trembling, and her eyes met his with a flicker of something new, something like trust, it felt like the world had shifted. That single act, unnoticed by the others, had cracked open a door in her heart, letting a sliver of light back in. Then there was the grandmother, her face lined with years of worry, her hands gnarled from a lifetime of hard work. She'd come to the workshop not for herself, but for the community, always lingering on the edges, watching the veterans with a quiet pride. Jake had seen the weight she carried, the way her shoulders sagged under the burden of loss and time. One cold morning, when the wind bit through the thin walls of the workshop, he'd slipped her a thermos of coffee, warmed from his own stash. He didn't say much, just a nod, a gruff, "It's cold out," but the way her eyes softened, the way her lips curved into a smile that held both gratitude and a rediscovered spark of hope, told him everything he needed to know. That small gesture had reminded her that she wasn't invisible, that someone still saw her, even in her quiet moments of struggle. And then there was the man. Nobody knew his name at first. He was just another face in the crowd, a drifter who lingered near the workshop, his clothes worn thin, his eyes hollow with hunger, and something deeper, something harder to name. Jake had noticed him one evening, sitting alone under the flickering streetlight, his hands empty, his gaze fixed on nothing. Without a word, Jake had walked over, sat beside him, and handed him half of his sandwich. It was nothing grand, nothing that would make headlines, but the man's eyes had glistened, and when he took the food, his voice cracked with a quiet "thank you." From that day on, the veterans called him the man who was saved with a sandwich, a name that carried both humor and reverence. To them, he wasn't nameless anymore. He was a reminder that even the smallest act could ripple outward, touching lives in ways no one could predict. Jake leaned back on the bench, his chest tight with the weight of these moments. He wasn't a hero, not in the way people usually thought of heroes. He didn't have a cape or a spotlight, no grand stage to stand on. But he believed in the quiet power of kindness, the kind that didn't need an audience. Every time he doubted himself, every time the world felt too heavy, he thought of that little girl's hesitant smile, the grandmother's grateful the man's trembling hand. Those moments were proof that doing what was right, even when no one was watching, could change everything. The workshop hummed on, the veteran's laughter mingling with the clatter of tools. The girl's pencil scratched softly, her drawings capturing the world she was slowly learning to trust again. Jake's friend was still waiting for an answer, his eyebrow raised, but Jake just shook his head, a faint smile tugging at his lips. He didn't need to explain it. The truth was in the air around them, in the hands building tables, in the hearts quietly healing. It wasn't complicated, not really. It was human, messy, flawed, and beautiful. And it was enough.